Well, hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mark Graven. I'm happy to be joined today by our guest, Ankit Patel. He is the founder of My Business Care Team, a BPO company or business process optimization company that provides services for optometrists. He is also co-founder with his wife of Classic Vision Care, an optometry group in Atlanta. Ankit has a strong background in lean methodologies. That's how we've met and known each other for quite a while now. He's worked as a lean consultant at Dell and at the Cleveland Clinic, driving process improvements and also coaching executives. He has a master's degree in positive organizational development and a bachelor's in industrial engineering. So we've got some overlap here, both bachelor's in IE, both some time working at Dell. We're going to talk about positive psychology and positive organizational development in the episode. So Ankit, let me just welcome you to the podcast. I was going to read a little bit more about the company, but I think we'll get to that as part of the conversation. So thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark. Really appreciate it. And I'm doing well today. So yeah, I can't complain. It's a nice day here. So
yeah. And here is in the Atlanta area, right?
It is, yes. Suburbs of Atlanta.
Yeah. I was trying to rack my brain. I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm trying to think before we get to your lean origin story. I'm trying to think back to the origin story of how you and I met. I know it goes back at least to 2009 and relatively early days of my blog. You wrote guest posts in 2009, 2010, 2012. I was surprised to learn or remember that you had not been here on the podcast. But do you remember how and where we crossed paths? Were you reading the blog? Was that it?
I do. It was, I don't remember exactly how I found you, but I remember connecting, I believe, on Twitter, or I reached out directly to you at some point, but I remember connecting, and we just maintained a relationship since that point. I at the time, I think I was doing consulting work as well in that time frame. And so you were gracious enough to have me write some I'll write articles on the site. And yeah, that's, I believe that's how we met. I can't remember the exact conversation, but I remember being like, oh, wow, that's a really cool book you have around lean healthcare at the time. And so that's what got me interested in connecting with you.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we did. We have a lot of, like I said, not just shared background, but shared interests. So we're going to get to explore that here today. And I'll apologize again for not having invited you to the podcast a while back. But so, Ankit, I know even if our recollections are fuzzy of exactly how and when we started talking, I know you do have a clear recollection of your own lean origin story. So as I tend to do with guests, I'm going to throw that question to you. Tell us, some of that origin story for you and what some of the context or even what the terminology was.
Yeah. So, it was interesting because I started my career at Dell doing manufacturing engineer. So project managing, figuring out solutions, usually machine type solutions, implementing them every year at Dell. And I think my fourth or fifth year there, we had a project. They were consolidating facilities, and they were moving one of the remanufacturing facilities from Austin, Texas to Nashville, which is where I was based. And I was part of the engineering team that did that. And I think there were some things going on in the background. I wasn't really sure about the political picture of what was going on, but our engineering team, we did a whole traditional design. We had something in place, and we had predicted at the time, I think we're going to get about a 10, maybe 15% productivity boost. And that was, we were excited about that. We were saying, get us a budget, get us going, and we'll put in all this machinery and we'll be rocking and rolling. And then somehow, somewhere, someone came in, I want to say, I think it was Dick Hunter at the time, and said, no, we're going to try this whole lean thing. And so there was a couple of people that came in on board, and I believe they used the Danaher system, which is a derivative of the Toyota production. I can't remember the exact history or lineage there, but it's very similar to the Toyota production system. And so we went through and we did a whole different line design based off of lean and lean principles.
Yeah.
And it was a really cool project to be on because we saw it go from, basically a brownfield project back to a greenfield project, completely redesigning it from scratch, the methodology to use that, and then rebuilt it and saw it implemented in real life. to give you some context, it was a very heavy machinery based solution, a lot of conveyor, stuff that wasn't movable. We use this product, I think it was called Creeform, but it's basically an adult
Yeah.
Lego set or a connector set.
Yeah.
And everything was portable, modular, and we ended up doubling productivity, not just a 10 or 20% increase.
Wow.
It was actually double the productivity when we actually rolled it out. I think those were the exact numbers. So that's what got me hooked. And what I loved about it was the process and the buy-in and the methodologies we used to get there. It was very logical, very rational. It was very creative. And it was not necessarily exactly consensus, but everyone was involved in the process.
Yeah.
And so it was very much like, oh, everyone's bought into it. We get this. And there's a lot of energy around it, and which was exciting. Fast forward a little bit from there. That's where I got started. And then from there, my interest grew into some consulting work, working in healthcare at the Cleveland Clinic. And now that framing of how to look at processes has never really left me.
Sure.
And I took that with me to optometry, where we try to focus on what is valuable for our patient base. And that's different than what may be valuable to a manufacturing customer. So that's been a fun journey to kind of work through.
Yeah. But as a dedicated glasses wearer, I wouldn't get anywhere without my glasses. So I value optometry very much, and ophthalmology when it's needed. But let's go back to talk about your time at Dell. So, like, more specifically, it's funny, the overlap that we had, not in the exact same years, but Dell Computer was my first job coming out of the graduate program at MIT. So I joined 1999 in Austin. You joined what year?
2004.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a 5-year difference. And the clock speed, if you will, of that industry and the pace of change was incredibly fast. And I reported up through Dick Hunter at one point, and then I think he rose. He did become, I think, the top manufacturing executive, if not for Dell Americas, Dell worldwide. I mean, he was one of the executive head honchos, right?
Yeah, I think after our project, he got promoted to worldwide from just Americas. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's we both worked for Dick, and then when I was there, and we'll come back and talk about some of that embrace of lean. When I was working there and having roots in the automotive industry, the word lean means certain things to me around Toyota production system or what General Motors was trying to do, and a lot of people in the media mainly, or analysts, I think, sort of conflated and confused. They would use the word lean to describe Dell and say, well, Dell has low inventory, they have high inventory turns. And well, I don't know if it's really a lean supply chain, because it was forecast based and long lead times. And then just that very last replenishment loop was essentially, a real time pull system. But then, beyond that, not asking you to wade into things you wouldn't want to discuss, but there's to me, there was a difference in culture, where I wouldn't have described it as a Toyota-ish culture. Dell had its own culture. There were times where I felt like the emphasis was a little bit too much on quantity over quality. I won't belabor that point, but then it's good to see at some point to come around to the lean approach. Danaher business system, which I think was really influenced by Shingijutsu, which is former Toyota people. So there is kind of a family tree there. But interesting to see that they would embrace not just some of that language, but some of the industrial engineering elements of lean, right, for line design.
Yeah. It was really interesting to see that shift. And I think there's some elements that made it easier culturally to absorb, because the one thing that we did focus in on heavily was culture. The book Creating a Lean Culture by David Mann, that was sort of the Bible, what we used. And we created the boards, the measurement system, creating all the stuff in there was derived from that too. So I think that was one of the main reasons for success, to be honest, for that, is because the culture took such a big precedence in how do we train the new staff, because we're starting over from a clean slate almost, right? Because no one's really seen lean or had an impression of lean in the facility. So it was a great opportunity for us to be a part of.
Yeah. And I'm sure working with frontline supervisors, managers, really supporting the frontline. I don't think Dell ever used the term team members. I'm going to use the Toyota term team members,
Yeah.
the frontline employees, right?
Yeah, and that was a lot of fun. I'm not gonna lie. That was a good time coming up with a design and just having that team environment, the camaraderie. It was fun. I enjoyed that environment.
Yeah, yeah, and there was a lot of that camaraderie of projects and work I got to do there, and people who are lifelong friends. So to be continued over a beverage sometime. On that. But then our shared interest then, of course, in healthcare. I would love to hear more about your transition into Cleveland Clinic and the things that you were learning and seeing and doing going into such a different environment.
So it was interesting because I got approached by a recruiter saying, "Hey, we have a job in the Cleveland Clinic. Would you be interested?" I was like, "Well, yes, that sounds like a good opportunity to go check out." And relatively still early in my lean journey, a couple of years removed from Dell, and I decided to take the job, and it was really interesting to see how healthcare approached it and how different companies approached it. So I think there are different models of deploying lean, and some people are much more project based and hierarchical. Some people are more ground up, grassroots, more team based. And I think that they both have their pros and cons. Healthcare, because of the nature of it, it's hard to just shut down a facility, right? And just focus on one thing at a time. So by the nature of the work, it ends up being more project based, more, hey, we need to get people in the room for a short amount of time, make decisions, and then go out and do a project to try to implement this. And so it was interesting seeing that. The culture is obviously different, right? Speed of change is much, much slower in healthcare. I remember there's a dress code, tie and suit every day. So, there was a whole, rightfully so, right? You don't want to move fast and break things in healthcare because you think people die. So it's not like software and other places where you want to move fast. So, I really enjoy the challenges, and it was also way more complex in terms of either self-induced or just the nature of healthcare is just more complex. And so, you've talked about it before. And actually, I remember consulting you on a challenge that I was having. I was like, I've got this one department, but they route to 20 different departments. And sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. And I remember you giving guidance on saying like, look, just focus on the path that has the most volume, and you're going to optimize some of the other stuff too. It's going to be better than we were before. I was like, that's really helpful to understand, because before it was like, okay, it was all encompassing. We were able to control the entire scope in one project. And in healthcare, it was hard to do that. And so kind of getting over some of those challenges was important. Was some of the learnings that I had with that.
Yeah. So things in healthcare, and this is not just a Cleveland Clinic point. It doesn't move at what they call Dell speed back in that environment. But that said, there's such opportunities to help establish standardized process. Without that, things are moving fast, and people maybe are being harmed along the way. So the starting point is it's so critically important to try to create stability, which is something people so often talk about in lean. First create stability. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of back to people we probably know in common, previous guests on this podcast. If you were reporting up through or working with like Dr. Lisa Yerian, who's been on the podcast, and Nate Hurl, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. We've heard a lot about the Cleveland Clinic approach here on the podcast.
Nate was my former boss at Cleveland Clinic, so that was tough. I was sad to hear about that. But Dr. Lisa, I did work with her a little bit. Not on a project per se, but she was in the ecosphere, so we got to spend some time with them. My time at Cleveland Clinic was relatively short, so they probably don't remember me if I was there. I was there for about a year or so before getting married and life changes happened. It was a really valuable experience. Learned a lot, and it was really neat to see that world. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
What I was going to say, a lot of my projects were actually at the Heart Valve Institute, which was that was just incredible. That was just really neat to see that experience of really like world-class, heart surgeons, and how they think about it, and just like brilliant minds, and just the way they work together was just really, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and there's so much opportunity to provide better support systems for those brilliant minds, brilliant hands and fingers. Because there are a lot of frustrations when things don't run smoothly, both for surgeons and the patients. Usually, those frustrations are pretty aligned.
Yeah, when it rains, it pours, right? So, because I think it's part of the nature of the complexity of it too, right? So, there's a lot of points for error to happen, and so over time, I think it gets better and people work on it. But yeah, it's really hard to, like you had said, it stabilize the process, make sure everything is consistent and running, and then how do you deal with people's fear of, well, if I change anything, it might hurt the patient care. And so there's a psychology around that too. So it's really, really, there's some interesting variables involved on the healthcare side.
Yeah. So you talked about life changes, marrying an optometrist, ending up in a practice. I'd love to hear more about that. And did that time working in healthcare at Cleveland Clinic, different scale than a practice setting would be? Did that give you confidence to help take on that challenge?
So I think being entrepreneurial or being in a smaller setting like that is very different than a large company.
Yeah.
I've always kind of had the entrepreneurial bug, so I enjoy that type of challenge. And there were some overlap in terms of, we looked at what was valuable to our patients and my wife. So we designed the whole process around what my wife wanted. Like, what kind of practice does she want to run? She wanted one that build relationships with patients. And so to do that, we decided, like, okay, you need slightly longer exam time. So we started off with doing 1 hour exams for her, which is unheard of in the industry. But we knew that in optometry, you've got options, right? So you can sell products, you can sell contacts, glasses. In addition to that, you can also do other services, like specialty services. So we wanted to specialize in that. And so the type of patient that really values the extra time in the doctor chair. And I know I learned what not to do from this situation, because I know there were people experimenting with optometry and lean at the time, but they were just focused on throughput. Like, how do you get more people through the door? And I was like, we're going to take the exact opposite and say, this patient base likes time with the doctor, so we're going to figure out how to make that work.
Well, so that's maximizing value as opposed to trying to minimize waste.
Exactly.
You could also be taking waste out of a process that is relationship building, right? More
correct.
Focus on value added time.
I would say if we had a high volume, low margin, low cost leader type practice, I think that would be the way to go. That's the type of, patients don't necessarily care as much about the time with the doctor, but that's not the direction we decided to go.
And so that, I imagine there were opportunities to, when I think of entrepreneurship and continuous improvement, I think of PDCA or PDSA cycles. I mean, I imagine you early on were testing some of that hypothesis and realizing, okay, this is working, with some opportunities for refinement, or it's just a matter of kind of choosing the model and executing it well?
So there's obviously refinement. So what we found was that, without getting too much into the business side, I'd be happy to dig in further if you're interested. But there's the economics of where you see all your ratios. So like your COGS, your cost of goods relative to the volume, and the product offerings relative to insurance, because there's insurance as part of the equation. They usually cap what you can do. So we actually had to do a SKU simplification, saying we're not going to offer all this stuff. It's not available here, period. And so we know that what we put here is the right thing for the patient and the right thing for the business too, because the business can stay alive and the patients will get a really good product at a fair price. So it was like kind of like a dealership model, right? We weren't the low end dealership. And we were more like a Lexus dealership, right? And so it was you get nicer products, nicer stuff. At the same time, you can trust what you see. It may cost more than, say, somewhere like a Walmart, but it's definitely a appreciable difference in the exam and the materials and the quality of the lenses.
Yeah. And then how is that communicated in terms of marketing and brand image to help people understand that this is a certain approach to optometry and vision care?
So we actually found that, and I could be wrong in this, but traditional advertising is okay for getting awareness, but it's a very retail driven business, right? People don't come more than like 3 to 5 miles usually to see the eye doctor in dense populated areas. So chances are wherever you are, you're going to get most of your patient base from that area, unless you're like super specialized in something that you get referrals for.
Yeah.
And so it's really a matter of people knowing you. And we found what's successful is word of mouth and
Mm-hmm.
referrals. And so our strategy was let's operationalize it so people feel a difference, and then they operationalize to them telling and trying to get referrals in, and also getting good reviews.
Yeah.
So we worked really hard at maintaining good, reviews in our system. Are we perfect? No. We do the best we can,
Mm-hmm.
but we have a decent Google rating at least. And so, I'll give you an example. When someone calls, we ask them a set of questions that kind of identify what's valuable to them.
Mm-hmm.
And in ours, we basically break down in value streams, basically, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we can get to this later, but we actually use AI to help us kind of categorize and how to speak to
Mm-hmm.
these patients too. So when they
Yeah.
come in, we know what to present to them, when to present to them, and what might be important to them. So if someone's very budget conscious, we're very aware of that when they come in, and we talk to them about their process. If someone's more health conscious, we know what to do. And so we kind of tailor, we have about 4 value streams, I guess you want to call it, 4 patient types that we look at. And so our process is different when you come in. When you spend time with the doctor, we actually create prescription plans tailored to their specific lifestyle. So we ask them questions like, well, what do you do for fun? When do you wish your eyes were better? And so there's a tailored experience to that. And we do assessment of things that normally don't get assessed. So there are things like meibomian gland, which is your eyes and the function of like the glands. So sometimes you may not feel it, but you may have dry eyes. So we're like, oh, hey, FYI, you may not feel it now, but we caught this. It may be a concern, just to let you know. So we try to take a full comprehensive picture of their eye health.
So I appreciate you sharing, a lot of these kind of, components of the system, of the business, of how it fits together. I wanted to ask you back to culture and management system, working with the staff and different functions within a practice. I'm just kind of curious what you've done or what you've learned. Are you able to apply creating a lean culture type concepts, or is that some of that more applicable to a bigger scale business?
It's very applicable to a lower scale. What I will say is it did not look like what I thought it would look like. Being a lean consultant in other roles, I was teaching, not doing. When I'm actually in the weeds, it's a little different. I will say this, and I know this may be heresy to some folks, but it's who first, then what second, with especially a small business. One bad hire can make a big difference. And so the who, focusing on that person, is really important. More importantly, that person should match well with you as a leader. That's one of the biggest lessons I've learned. I've got to learn my strengths and my weaknesses as a leader, and I can't pick someone that I'm not going to be good at managing. Perfect example is I'm much more of an introvert. While I can do things, have conversations, the pat on the backs, it's not natural for me. And there are some folks who, and again, for me, it's not a strength. So I am a very poor manager for them. And so in those situations, those are not necessarily good fits. They may look great on paper, but they're not great for our working environment because we're such a small team, 14 people, right? Or so. And so once you kind of understand that, we actually use EOS or traction in our companies, which is fantastic for smaller companies. And there's a big part of the accountability chart that they have, which is clear lines of delineation, your standard of work, right? Define the process. It's all there. And the best part about that is you have to take ownership of your numbers. And so you're expected to come in with ideas. And if you don't know those ideas, we find you ways to solve the problem, but we do it together. And so it's the closest thing to a lean operating system that I've seen for a smaller company. It works really well.
Because EOS is entrepreneurial operating system, I think. I read that book, Traction, a long time ago. A friend of mine has worked as an EOS consultant, and she had recommended the book. And I wrote a blog post once. You could kind of crosswalk.
Yeah,
there are a lot of
overlap,
similarities. But like you said, an entrepreneurial setting, whether it's KaiNexus is a software company, or that is, I think, general common startup advice of the who really does matter, quite a bit, and avoiding a quote unquote bad hire, and that, like you said, could mean bad fit, not bad person.
Hmm.
But it seems like in a smaller environment, there would be opportunities to try to hear everybody's ideas and engage people in improvement. That could be one of the factors you try to hire for, without the bureaucracy that a large corporate setting might put in your way.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say is if you are going out on your own, entrepreneurial. So this is where some of the psychology and knowing running a business has come in. Past success, it tends to determine future success, tends to. So you want to look for types of things that they've done in the past. So if you look at their work history or their extracurricular activity and they've never been a leader, they've never really had a problem solve, chances are, and again, this may not be ideal, but I don't really want their opinion on stuff because they've never done it before in the past. I can teach them how to think about it and learn about them, but you kind of scale their opinions and thoughts on things. They're not an expert in the process. They're not an expert in problem solving, right? Or at least they haven't demonstrated it yet. And so you want to be careful about taking those, because so many times I've taken those ideas and ran with them and it just caused more harm and more just set us back a little bit. And so that was some of the biggest learnings I've had in the first few years of having the business. Is it really matters how you take in advice and who's ready and what level are they ready for. You can consult them, you can inform them, or you can hold them accountable and responsible for it, right? The whole racy piece. But knowing who you just inform and consult versus who you actually put responsible for coming up with ideas is there's a big gap there. And I didn't realize that when I first started.
But the PDSA cycles continue.
Yeah.
The learning and moving forward. So the other thing, one main thing we wanted to talk about next, speaking of moving forward and entrepreneurship, is the new business involving AI and BPO. And there's sort of an origin story there of how you kind of found this need and this opportunity, right?
Yeah. So we had 5 locations back in, or four or five. I forget exactly how many we had, but we had 5 at one point in 2019. And it was really hard to get enough people, even before COVID, to get enough people consistently trained, spread out over 5 locations in Atlanta. And so we had to figure out a way to do that. So we decided to centralize some of the functions. So we would have consistent processes, consistent output for phone answering specifically, and things like back office tasks, like billing, filing, insurance. And what ended up happening was we ended up getting some support from, we globally resourced some folks. So people from outside of our 4 walls, outside of the country in some cases, helping us support those functions. And as COVID hit and people left, we started augmenting with more folks who were outside of the area, because that's the only people that were available to work. And so it ended up growing. And fast forward to 2021, 2022, late 21, early 22, we started doing a friends and family, helping them out, doing something similar. And then fast forward to 23, we launched My Business Care Team, which is specifically optometry specific. What we say is like anything you can do remotely, we can help you with. And now this year, we've been heavily focused on technology with the advent of AI, artificial intelligence, with ChatGPT and all the other ones out there. It's really making a difference in terms of things that we can do and implement and really provide more value and more better care for patients. At the same time, helping doctors run their business better.
And I imagine there's a benefit in finding customers and communicating. Okay, we have this focus on optometry. I mean, they're not trying to push you in other directions, but like there's probably this balance of thinking through focusing on optometry versus thinking more broadly for any type of medical practice, dentists or et cetera.
Yeah. So, well, we can do it for anyone, right? Anyone that has any kind of remote work. We can multi-location retail is really our ideal type of person because we can centralize a lot of their functionality that they have. We do optometry because it's more from a business strategy standpoint. Go deep in one market that you know really well. I know the exact problems that every one of these people face because I've already been there, and so it's much easier to penetrate that market and get deep there and being an expert there. But we could easily go to other markets, and that at some point that would probably be the plan. But since we do understand the problems, we also have our own test bed, right? We have our own location still.
Mm-hmm.
We have 2 locations now. We actually consolidated down. And so we're constantly testing different things in our office first before we roll it out to our client base. So we have a lot of different cutting edge type things that we're doing around training, development, around patient experience, and around automation. I guess technically it's automation, right? Jidoka, I think that's right.
Automation,
Yeah, it's basically like how to use the machines to help with automation and make sure it flows well versus automation for the automation's sake. And so we're trying to leverage AI to do a lot of those pieces that, quite frankly, as a small business, were just too expensive to do before.
Mm. So from your background with lean and thinking of processes, and how do you decide where to use AI with a lean lens instead of using AI because it's cool or fun or trendy, or trying to use the proverbial AI hammer and everything looks like a nail? How do you prioritize or identify what would be the right places to use AI?
Same like you do with lean. Start with the need, right? Where is there a need? So the number one complaint is staffing, and the staff that you do have, how do you train them? And so right now we're using AI specifically around training and development of staff. So opticians are the people that sell the glasses, and there's a whole process around that. We've created we're creating like a 6-week modules and training for them, but the assessments actually take into consideration, do you have deep knowledge? So AI is almost like human cognition. So you don't have to ask multiple choice. You can ask open-ended questions now, and it can score it very accurately. And you can know if someone actually knows it or not. And so that's an area that's really helpful, because now we don't need someone grading these assessments, and we know if they have a deep understanding and knowledge of what we're trying to test and ask them. Another area is around recordings. So we actually do practice sessions, and they do recordings of it, and they upload it, and the AI breaks it down in different categories, different scores, and gives them what they could have said differently without having to have that person in there doing that. And so that's a great way to, again, a 50% solution, 100% implemented, right? It's not perfect, but it's way better than what we were doing before. And just the fact of auditing and submitting recordings daily has improved. We rolled this out like 4 weeks ago. We've improved by 20% in terms of our financial numbers, and our patients are happy because our ratings still keep going up in our feedback. So what we're doing, it seems to be working. We're also using it so we answer phones for a lot of clients. We've actually done it for our quality pieces. So we take a redacted transcripts, HIPAA compliant ones, analyze them for different scores and different outputs. And it tells us, hey, was a problem solved? Was it not solved? What was a quality rating? Was a disposition? What could have done better? And it gives them a coaching sheet based off of trends it's seeing. So those are all pain points that we had, because how do we get better quality? How do we get better training? And so we've just started there. The next things we're looking at are how do we get phone agents, virtual phone agents overnight, so we can always service the patients, chatbots that can make appointments, right? Doing all that. So how can we be almost like even when we're not available, we're still available.
Yeah. And this involves custom software development on top of one of the large language model AI platforms to have such a specialized application. Is that right?
Well, you just need API access, and most of the stuff we built in Zapier, or we hired someone off of Fiverr and said, here's the requirements. And you have to have a little bit of idea how to do software. I don't have much, but I have a little bit. So it kind of give general guidance. And again, it's 50% solution, 100% implemented. Is it a robust solution that's perfect? No, but it's definitely better than where we were, and it's giving us progress. Some of the solutions you can do off of Zapier and with OpenAI, like API access. Some of them you can build on your own, but all the large language models, for the most part, are designed to be called their call function calling. So you call their API, you pass it some information, and it gives you information back. So it's a pretty clean handshake.
And then as you're working with people, there's probably this lean habit that's ingrained around not trying to automate a bad process, right? So this is where the BPO, business process, in the BPO is so important. Can you share an example of either improving the process first, or even establishing process before thinking about automation or AI?
Yeah, the best example is many times when we talk to optometry offices, one of the most common calls they get is, "Hey, where's my product that I ordered? My glasses." And I was like, "Well, we can take care of those problems for you. We can call the lab, figure out the status, do whatever we need to. However, it's probably best if you set expectations up front and make sure your processes are clean up front. So you're sending the products out fast enough, you're following up on the jobs, and it's prioritized. So most of the times, what ends up happening is that the jobs aren't put in that same day. They wait a couple of days before they ship them out. There's 2 days shipping. Then they get to the lab. There might be a breakage, which happens, not often, but often enough for it to cause issues. 2 days shipping back, and then by that point, it's already like almost 3 weeks. When the expectation was 2, but the patient may not even known it was 2 weeks because you didn't communicate that up front either. So that's a perfect example of how we'll actually go in and process consult for them. It's like, hey, this is a best practice that we have. And then we'll get on the back end, we'll call your labs for you to figure out where the jobs are and kind of make sure they expedite the ones that are coming closer to due, and kind of manage that for you. But you got to have it tight on the front end from a communication standpoint and from a expectation standpoint and process.
Yeah. And would you say, I mean, is the AI technology advancing really fast, or is your ability to work with it and adjust the use of AI? I mean, those are probably both moving forward, or what's the potential there? Do you need radically better technology at this point, or is it a matter of harnessing the technologies that are there now?
It depends on the use case. Depending on how much cognition a task needs. So, like, to replace a human being, it's technically, well, by the time this is released, I may be wrong, but some of the more complex stuff is not quite there yet. Although they just released a new model, Claude 3, which is supposed to be really, really good. So I don't know. I'll play with it and see. But it works really well for most use cases, especially like I'll call mid-level complexity work. Now, is it going to come up with a 5-year strategy and market, studies and all that? Not yet. But it's definitely, quite honestly, I think at least in our offices, most things could be assisted or replaced with that level of cognition. And it's not really cognition; it's not the right word, but I'll use that for people's.
It appears to be.
Yeah.
So I mean, right? I mean, it seems like cognition. So it sounds like there's opportunities, maybe even more broadly, because when we talked previously and what we're talking about here today, like this idea of evaluating and people's training and their progress, and it seems like an opportunity to have faster PDCA or PDSA cycles that could be applied to continuous improvement practices and development of people's ability to do Kaizen or A3s. I'm just thinking out loud here. Like, could the AI tool evaluate if someone's problem statement is good or if it's jumping to a solution? Can things like that be evaluated that way?
That's actually a perfect use case for it. You can actually, now where you have to have the expertise is to understand the rubric to score against to give appropriate feedback. But once you come up with that, just upload a PDF picture or just a picture of the A3 and it'll spit back the feedback. And that's a perfect use case for it. Another use case is the more complex. So the less deterministic a task, the more variability, the more different options that are, so more like in the service industry. Anytime you have that, that's a great use for it to get feedback on. Like what we use for our when people want to buy glasses, there's so many different variables that go into it. And it's hard to know exactly where. So we have some critical factors, but we want to make sure the staff is reminded of all those critical factors. So it's really a tool for learning, more so than feedback. Because ideally the feedback is part of the learning cycle. But we've noticed that people are like, I want to get 100% on this. How do I get it? And so they'll just go one thing at a time. Like, let me work on this. And so we finally have a couple of people that actually, they start off like, 20%, and now they're, regularly hitting the 100% mark on the evaluations.
Yeah. No, I don't have an AI podcast host buddy evaluator that afterwards is going to say, you know what, you could have asked that question more efficiently. You missed an opportunity to ask a follow-up clarifying question. Maybe that's going to happen someday. But I'll tell you, within the last year, there are some AI tools to help support me as a podcaster. The transcripts
Mhm.
for episodes are better, much better than a previous automated tool that I was using, which they called AI, but it never learned how to spell my last name correctly. So I don't know how much machine learning
Yeah.
was happening, but and these tools will, it doesn't know what the best title for an episode was, but it'll give you a list of 15.
Mhm.
Like, oh, okay, that's you might piece two of them together to come up with, here's, I think, a good episode for the title. There are some things like that that are both a time saver and a money saver compared to some services that I was using before. New functionality, and in some cases, it's actually both better and cheaper.
Yeah, and the more you can actually do complex flows. So if you're trying to figure out a title, by the way, the AI will currently do what you're saying. It just won't do it great, right? If you dump the transcript in post after the fact, you can do it live too. It's just more tricky, but it'll tell you like, hey, you could have asked this, potentially asked this, with mixed results. It's not, as good as No, I don't think so, but maybe sometimes it'll be good. But as far as the more complex tools, so you can layer on AI doing different parts and tie them together. So one part might be, I want to do a study in terms of what keywords are really resonating well with the audience. So there's a way to do an analysis there. If you know how to do that, you can create some automation there, and then say, okay, now we know the words. Compare that against what might be a good topic for this based off the entire transcript, and then figure out 5-10 titles that would rank well from an SEO perspective or whatever. And you can do that. And that's where it's kind of going. All the basic functionality, like just putting stuff in, rewriting things, those are things that are good, but the real magic happens when you go multi-step.
Multi-step, what does that mean?
So like we just said, right? So like with the training protocol, it's one step is I have to figure out what good looks like. And create that. So I have that knowledge from lean and other background. I take that knowledge, that's one step, and then I put in creating a rubric and test the rubric. That's step 2, and step 3 is deploying it, and then doing is a PDSA or PDCA cycle on refining that, making sure like, oh, is the output where I want it to be? Yes or no? No. Okay, let's go back and try that again. Is it where I want it to be? Yes or no? And doing that over and over again.
Okay.
Will it tell you? Like, if you don't understand training theory, will it give you a good starting point? Yes, but it'll take a lot longer to get through those cycles to get to where you want to be.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe one other topic we can cover a little bit here is, your master's degree is in positive organizational development. That's not something I've really heard about before. I have heard the phrase positive psychology, and I I'll say I don't know anything about that. I've heard the term. So I'd be curious, what is meant by positive organizational development? How did you find that as a field to study and get your degree? What appealed to you, and what's different about it?
Yeah. So a positive organization, positive OD or positive psychology is very similar. It's building off of strengths. So traditional, what do you think about traditional OD and traditional problem solving, right? It's not necessarily negative per se, but it's very break fix focused. It's very much mechanistic. It's very much like, hey, what's the problem? How do we fix it? Positive psychology says the opposite. What's working well, and how do we build and broaden off of that? So it's a completely different way of looking at the same thing. So if you have a 90% satisfaction rate with your customers, traditional problem solving, traditional OD, whatever, it says, look at the 10% that are wrong, versus this way says, why do 90% of us like us, and what can we do to do more of that? Even if it's like the opposite, if it's 10% positive, 90% negative, why do 10% like us, and what can we do around that and do more of that?
So instead of defining that gap as the 10%, the problem, if you will, trying to understand what's working well. And I don't know if this is my nature or my education or the work. To a fault, I focus on the gap. So when you talk about reflection and what does that mean as a leader and working with others, it's not my default. I have to force myself to celebrate the stuff that's going well, because I'm just so wired or it's such a habit or both to focus on, okay, well, now the gap's 8%.
Yeah.
Now the gap's 6%, just to keep striving toward that. Some people really, that doesn't resonate with people. And,
Yeah. And
with some people.
they both work in different situations. I will say there's a place and time for both. If you're in a highly fast moving type environment where cycles of improvement make a difference, the positive psychology can work really well. If you're in a very established industry that doesn't move, is very competitive, and operational execution it's got to be perfect, then yeah, you want gap analysis because that's what's most important. So it is contextual and it is circumstantial, but there's no reason to avoid half of looking at the positives versus negatives, and everything has its place and its time. To answer your question about why and what brought me to it. The Cleveland Clinic, actually, when I was working there, they worked with Case Western on a program, a master's program, and that was one of the programs they partnered with. And so I started, when I was at Cleveland Clinic, I started the program. I left the Cleveland Clinic before but I did finish the program. I just left the Cleveland Clinic before I finished the program. Yeah. And it was, I knew I wanted more education. I wanted to learn something. I didn't feel like an MBA was my path. It didn't excite me. I was like, I really don't want to, I was like, I feel like, I would make a lot of connections, but what would I really learn and to grow? And I didn't feel like I would get as much from that as I would this. This was something completely different. In my entry essay, I said like, look, I want to know how I can change the world. Right. Very, very ignorantly mentioning something like that. Right. It's like, and so it was interesting because I feel like, okay, now there's some set of tools and understanding and a knowledge and insight that I didn't have before, which was really valuable for me.
The it really resonates with me what you're saying about, to kind of recap if I heard you right, the positive OD or positive approach works well when you have rapid change, opportunities for lots of cycles, and I could see where that would fit well in a startup or an entrepreneurial setting or an opportunity where you're really striving for better, as opposed to a time when, let's say, you have the business model and the services or the products, like you've reached that product market fit, as the lean startup people might say, steady state operations where you're hopefully still improving, of course. But yeah, I could see those different settings you may dip into. I hate to use the phrase toolbox, but so these aren't tools, but so forgive me for that. But
well, they frame as interventions, right? So change interventions, and so and Kaizen, there's a lot of positive psychology built into Kaizen events because you're getting group consensus. The system as a whole typically participates in the events, right? That's another concept that they talk about, and then you all align on a goal. It's not always we try to focus on what could be. At least when I ran Kaizen events, it was always like what's possible. Can we do this? Have we done it before at all? Can we test it? And so it was more about what's possible instead of like, oh gosh, what's broken, what's wrong. And so that there can be some overlap there.
And I think of my friend and co-author Joe Schwartz. We did the Healthcare Kaizen book together. One thing we talked about, I think this was in an episode, of how there's a phrase they would use doing Kaizen improvements of, how might we, as a positive framing of, sometimes people fall into, here's why we can't, and throwing out the barriers, and that could be legitimate, but then kind of turning some of that framing into how might we, what would we have to do for this approach to work, instead of kind of falling back and giving up when we hit a barrier.
One of the best tools I like to use in conjunction with efforts when I was doing lean in larger companies, and I use it at a smaller scale now, is a tool called appreciative inquiry, or intervention called appreciative inquiry, which is also initialed AI, which just gets a little confusing. But appreciative inquiry is a great way to frame a mindset and frame direction. So what we'll do is, if I'm introducing lean to someone new, we'll spend maybe 4 hours or so doing appreciative inquiry, investigation, and interview around whatever topic it might be. So the topics I've used before are seamless, world-class communication, and connecting communication. I've used world-class manufacturing. And then you kind of define what that is. And then you ask them for stories. This is the different part, right? The data collections and stories. When did you experience this topic that we're studying? And what was it like? What were you doing? How did it feel? And so what it does is it generates all these positive emotions and excitement around, oh yeah, and it kind of relive that. It makes it feel real. And then you ask them a future-based question. 10 years from now, you're successful in this concept. How did you start it today? What was your role in it? And so you start seeing, I can't tell you how many times we do this, and like there's so much energy to change and drive after that. So it's just people are just bought in, right? They're like, oh yeah, let's do this. And so it makes that a lot easier because it gets everyone on the same page. The alignment and agreement's better because they've co-created a vision together that they want based off the framing that you set up front. And that's a really, really powerful way to kind of use it.
Wow. Well, a lot of food for thought here today, not just around the technology, but how do we use it? How do we harness it, if you will? And it's fun to talk about some of these other approaches. That makes me want to dig a little deeper into positive organizational development. Maybe since I'm going to stop apologizing for not having invited you before. I can invite you to come back in the future. Maybe we can take a deeper dive into that and some of the, talk more about the psychology of change. I think that would be a great topic to explore even further.
I appreciate that. Thank you for having me. So I'm glad to be on the show.
Yeah. Glad to have you here again. Our guest today has been Ankit Patel. I'll make sure there are links in the show notes to the business and LinkedIn profile if you want to reach out to Ankit and learn more about this, or if you're involved in a practice that could use some of this support. I'm sure there's opportunities to connect. So again, thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for the great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mark.